after my window here, but
That's good.
uh,
Well, this is episode one of Reality Principle. I'm here with Gregor Maximus Wilford. Greg is a Christian theologian and teacher and a compatriot of the CTMU. You can find him here on YouTube at Greg M. Wilford or Rumble at Gregor Maximus Wilford, on Substack at gregmwilford.substack.com. All those links will be in the descriptions there. Anything I forgot to mention?
no, that's just really a pen name. So I use it for. I think it's more catchy than my boring name, but uh,
Oh,
real name's
that's good.
Greg Wilford, but Gregor is Maximus is kind of a
That is
idea.
cool. I didn't want to dead name you.
Yeah,
How are you today?
good. How are you?
I'm well.
You're putting on a lot of videos, eh? You did the introduction with the free will thing there. It's very good.
Yep.
Yeah.
The I'll start with Bernardo Castro. I was watching an interview with him, and Idealist Philosopher he says there are 8 billion definitions of God. Seeing as your work in theology, metaphysics, etc., all centers on God's essence and existence, I think the natural first question would be, who is God in your view, and how do you know that He exists?
Well, I'm Christian, so the God, my God, is a triune God. And it's also a monotheistic God in the sense that he's the sole God. So if you were to ask me whether I believe that Zeus existed or Odin existed or any of the other gods, I'd say no. I recently did a video where I said that recurring in history is the central cast that we see in Christian Jewish religion gets all the way there too because they they believe in the same God. It's the same God. The Old Testament is the Jewish God is the God of the Christians. Uh, but if you're asking me about it, I'd say the central casting is Satan, and Satan is versus God, and then Jesus is versus death. Death. It's interesting in Revelation. I talk about death and Hades. So being cast into the lake of fire as well, or cast into hell as well. Death and Hades. And those were Greek and Jewish kind of negative forces and gods in their own right, death and Hades. And so you see the central casting, and Jesus' victory was over Satan, but it was also over death and Hades, I think. And I'm coming to these new concepts all the time, and you can richly explore the metaphysic of Christianity or religion and come away with something newer and better each time, that each iteration that you come to it. I prepared some notes because I wasn't sure if we were talking to Jonathan Mize today, but if you want to get into CTMU later, I've got four major questions in the form of questions that we can get to. But God, yeah, it's a triune God. Jesus is one aspect of God, and I don't know if you saw this, but there's this new channel. There's this channel called Wider Perspective Productions, and they take the Shroud of Turin, which I didn't believe in before, but they take a negative image and they reproduce with AI the image of Jesus, and it's pretty amazing. Like it takes you back and kind of awestrucks you when you see it. But there's controversy with the Shroud of Turin there for sure.
Yeah, I was researching that the other day because I got a comment about that. The how do you think how would you respond to someone who would say, I just don't believe in God or anything spiritual or metaphysical. I think the universe is just basically as it is. And anything with God, free will, or the soul, that's all, just woo.
Well, this is a thought that I've had for a while now, is that the universe is as it is. It was given to us. It was handed down to us. We didn't. There is a sense in which we self-select, but in some sense, we didn't select to be born. Something selected for us. The universe selected for God selected for us. But this isn't Christianity. Isn't just some new fad that popped up 100 years ago. It was handed to us in full spectrum dominant sort of idea of theology with the Word of God, the Scripture, the tradition of the Church. And if you believe in that, which I do, believe in natural revelation, where you look at the sun or you look at the trees, how beautiful they are, and you say there's a creator here. It's even beyond William Paley's intelligent design argument where I said if you see a watch, then you know that a watchmaker's nearby. It's more than that. It's more awe-inspiring than a watch found on the beach, let's say. But I would say the universe is as it is, but it was handed to us with this document called the Bible, which is, and I'm not even a Protestant strong on sola scriptura. I believe tradition is important as well. It's almost equal as important, pretty much equal as important. But we were handed this facticity of events: the Christ event, the God event, Moses and Exodus, all these things. So to them, I would say it's kind of like Peterson says, these stories couldn't have emerged without some higher principle. Although he doesn't want to touch God, I would say these words appeared on paper in the way that they did because of a God creator. So
Yeah, so that kind of gets into the Heidegger's idea that we're kind of thrown into reality. How
mm,
would a lot of the CTMU in particular focuses on teleology, telic recursion, telesis, all the what do you think the teleology of the universe is? Like what is it striving towards? Why is there something rather than nothing?
yeah, I'll make two quick points. The first is that I think teleology in itself is proof of God's existence. I wrote an article that discussed that said that teleology is in the room right next to me. We all know that we have intrinsic ends, purposes, goals for our life. We all know that we're aiming at something, that we're going forward, like Pearson says. But it's really teleology, intrinsic ends, purposes, goals in your life that manifest themselves through your life. That's the first proof of God. Because if it was all random matter and evolution crashing into each other, dissipating, all that stuff, there would be no purpose. There'd be no, like they say, morality can't exist without a creator God. And then the second point, what was the question again?
Like
Teleology.
like what is the teleology of the universe? Like it's obvious that there is some sort of end if there's all this complexity, but what is the actual purpose of that?
This gets back to a video I just did. So I have very good, very thanks for reminding me. The second point was that God is clearly trying to ferry something out of believers, of humanity in general, but of believers. And this looks to be what Jesus called the highest commandments: faith in God, faith and love of God, and love of your neighbor. And love your neighbor as yourself. So God, it's clear through Scripture, and it's clear through the acts of what happened to the apostles and subsequent martyrs in Christendom, that God, He doesn't really, it's not that He doesn't care about suffering, but He's looking for something higher, superordinate to suffering, or the transcendence of suffering. And He's trying to ferry that out of His believers. So you read about Ignatius of Loyola. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but or Justin Martyr, who martyrs are named after. And all the 12 apostles met a violent death, and they all were martyred. And then there's this quote from John chapter 21 verses 18 to 19, where he's resurrected and he's sitting on a beach cooking fish, and he says three times to Peter, uh, "Do you love me?" And then feed my sheep. And Peter takes that in, and then Jesus said to him, "When you were younger, you girded yourself and went where you wanted to go. But when you are older, you will be girded and carried where you do not wish to go." Meaning that, and it foreshadowed that Peter would be crucified upside down. So there's something that matters to God that I use this word ferry out. He's trying to draw us across the great divide: faith and love. To our quickest understanding, it looks like faith and love. That's the purpose of teleology.
So if there was no creation, then there never could be any faith or love, any positive thing happening from God's perspective.
Yeah, it'd be kind of like the Rick and Morty universe. I don't know if you watch Rick and Morty, but the absurdist where Rick can teleport to a realm where all the people are made of like goo or something, and then they shuffle around and they bump into each other and people die all the time, but there's no purpose to it. Uh, just even the fact that there's a story behind a narrative story, and get into psychological research with this idea of narrative identity, narrative identity, morality, teleology, and faith and love are all proofs of God's existence, a proof of a creator God, and they are the purpose and meaning of life, in my humble opinion, at this point in my life.
Yeah, and then also back to Rick and Morty, of course. Um, if you have this kind of multiverse idea where instead of saying there's a teleology, the universe is just splitting off at every little quantum event,
yeah,
then it seems like you're just adding structure to avoid an obvious fact.
yeah, yeah. There's this one guy I watch. He says that if he found out that aliens existed, he wouldn't believe in God anymore. I would say if I found out aliens existed, I would want to believe in God even more, because then it's kind of like Halo with the Halo universe. How we were the architects of the original system, and humanity was the forerunners, and then they created the system. Only it's more that God created creation for man. He put man at the center of not center because Christ is the center, but almost as the stewards of creation, right? And going back to Adam, and so yeah, if the universe is splitting off and there's fractionating and coming into getting into absurdism, you see, absurdism is already a really existential part of our current existence now. When you don't believe in God, absurdism reigns, and even when you are religious, absurdism can enter your life. So it's even in our supposedly stable state, where it seems our consciousness is stable, we still come up against absurdism, but it doesn't hold water. And Lang kind of proves systematically that there's intrinsic self-determinacy and self-selection throughout creation, right? Uh, so yeah, and I don't see. Uh, Absurdism, as strong as the argument of absurdism can be made, it it launches back into, sorry, getting the light adjusted here. It launches back into, you want to hold more faithfully to the creator God, I think.
Yeah, the since you brought up, what do you think about the possibility of extraterrestrial life? Because this is something I've been thinking about recently. Of why are there these billions of galaxies and stars, etc., if not
Mm.
for some purpose at some point?
It's a good question. I kind of like, well, if you're getting into the sci-fi aspect of it, which I think is important, there's a couple sci-fi movies that are really critical to this. First of all, unrelated is Elysium. If you watch Elysium, that's a really good movie, sci-fi movie. But then Star Wars and let's say, what's the other one? Halo, the Halo video game universe. Uh, Maybe man is made to traverse the stars. There's no ruling it out, because there's a Doug Wilson said, he's a pastor in Moscow, Idaho. He said uh, God talks about wealth a lot in the Bible, wealth and accumulation of property, this sort of thing. But he doesn't talk so much about technology apart from wine presses and chariots and stirrups and all these things. But anything that is invented, like let's say a tractor didn't exist 200 years ago, but it exists today. It's a technology that exists today, and you get into Heideggerian talking about techne, uh, the nature of technology. Maybe man is meant to traverse the stars. It's not beyond my realm of conception that that could happen. You know, like all the things Elon Musk is doing. But I think really space travel, even traveling at the speed of light, you couldn't reach a star in 1,000 years. So there's gonna have to be like science where they cut slits in the fabric of space time and wormhole through to other dimensions. But there's nothing a priori about the Bible that disbars man from going venturing outside of the earth. I don't think, right? Uh, and then Doug Wilson says we might even be considered part of the early church in today's times. We don't know how long history. There's the post-millennialist, the amillennialist, and all the futuristic ideas about when Jesus will return, the second coming, the end of times, the rapture. We could, for all we know, we could be part of the early church.
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking on the scale of millennia, but that could be, millions of years that the universe is just almost like a playground for eventually we're able to couple with that and return to God
Yeah.
fundamentally as our identity. I think we should get back because this is the major difference between Christianity and any other religion is the idea of the Trinity.
Yeah.
A problem which I've been thinking about recently is like if you like how could we historically verify, for example, that Jesus never committed one sin, which would disqualify him as God?
Before I answer, can you hear me all right? Is the audio quite quiet, or can you hear
No,
me?
it's fine.
Okay, good. So how can we prove that Jesus didn't sin? Um, I think by the ends, the teleology of the ends, how he died, which was eyewitnessed and was verified. How he died, and he said on the cross, he did have his moment of doubt, by the way. But Paul Washer said that the argument for Jesus, but in Jesus' own heart, was settled in the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but Gethsemane is when he got down in the nighttime before he was seized by the group of soldiers, and he prayed to God and said, "If I don't want this to happen to me, but if it be your will, then let it be done." And then the way he died, and the way that he resurrected not only himself but three others before him, including Lazarus. Uh, you can take the sometimes you can look at the end consequence and you can say, well, we arrived at this logical end, this teleological end, by a series of events that had to be in place. So for Jesus to be the God, the triune God, it's like that argument. You either believe he's a madman, a liar, or Lord. And the fact that he was seen resurrected by witnesses that went 12 witnesses, and even hundreds of witnesses, but 12 key witnesses that went to their deaths for it, martyrdom for it. Like I said, scarcely would you die for a good man, let alone like Jesus died for the sins, but then these people that followed Jesus, they died for the belief in the resurrection. So sometimes, this can be reversed too. You can look at the bad consequences. Like you can look in today's times on the cultural Marxism and the sexual identitarian revolutions that are sweeping up into bad areas that you don't want them to go into, and you can say the end is wrong. So something that led up to the end is wrong. You know,
Yeah, that if
that's what I
when
think.
we turn away from Christ, everything falls apart, then that it seems like that's almost it's reasonable to think that that is the logos which kind of holds the universe and society together.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Go ahead.
it's also interesting one thing because Slavoj Žižek in his debate with Jordan Peterson says that when Jesus says, um, what was it? Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? That's basically an admission that even God can't bear human existence. But if you actually go, I was reading the psalm the other day that that's from,
Hmm.
and if you read the whole thing, it's actually Jesus is almost referencing that psalm, which is talking about how God triumphs over death. So it's actually almost a hidden
Yeah,
message.
Zizek takes it out of context. I used to love Zizek, and I still do like him as a person, but he's an avowed atheist, and he wants to make a counterintuitive point, but he robs it of its context, and he robs it of the greater context in which Jesus said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" And then he dies, and then like Pearson says, there's an end to the story, which is resurrection, right? Anastasis, resurrection of the body. So in the moment, maybe that was shown. Like it also says in I think Romans chapter 8, he said Paul says, through height, nothing can separate us from the love of God, no, neither height nor depth, and that relates to the personal struggle, nor not to the height of your relationship with other people, but the height of, okay, I'm high this day, I'm happy this day, and then I'm at the depths today, the next day, but God doesn't separate His love from you in height nor depth, and so Jesus obviously on the cross. It was a tragedy. It was a tragedy. He was crucified by people he was purporting to save, and he was pain, and he felt the pain. He did feel the pain, by the way. So he was in a moment of depth and despair, and he said, "Why have you forsaken me?" And that's kind of another good movie if you watch it is the movie Silence with Andrew Garfield. I think it was is the main guy, and then Adam Driver, and they're about Jesuit priests that go to Japan. And at one point, he cries out like, "I don't hear your voice in this country, God. Like I call out to you, and I don't hear your voice. Respond to me." And that is a valid part of experience. Is that, and Jesus proved that when he said that sometimes you feel abandoned by God, you feel like you speak to an empty void and nothing is returned to you. But something my pastor said in the group Bible study is look back over, don't look back day to day. Look back over 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. Look how God has guided you, and after being faithful, look how God has guided you in your life. Right? Like it's funny. I wrote in my journal 2 years ago that I wanted to be part of some sort of psychological association because I was in a psychology degree at the time. I've always wanted to associate and be in a collection of minds that produce some valid works. And I always, for some reason, I didn't ever consider myself a scientist or anything. But then we start this thing, this Facebook group with the CTMU compatriots, and it's like an association. And the CTMU is the most radical science there is,
Yeah.
right? So it's like God answered that wish, and sometimes you just have to sit back and appreciate what's happened in your life for you to see it, really.
Yeah. This is another question because I've been
Yeah,
interested in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus just recently.
yeah,
It if you think about all of the worst things that you could do, genocide, oppression, murder, surely the worst thing possible would be killing the Son of God. So
yeah,
how could that, like, if you think about, Langan talks about a global wipe of when
yeah,
humanity's just gotten so bad that it's not even worth it anymore.
yeah.
Why wouldn't that be the moment?
Why wouldn't that be the moment of what
Of
of the worst possible thing happening?
Yeah, when humanity is basically irredeemable.
Well, I don't think that humanity is ever fully irredeemable, whether it be Noah's flood, where Noah was the last saved man and his family, or like is told to Elijah in First Kings, I think it's chapter 18, but I'm not sure. God says, Elijah says, "Why don't you come down and destroy my Israelite people because they've been basically unfaithful to you?" And God says, "I have reserved a remnant of 7,000." So it may be that those who are saved are only in the minority. I believe that it's much wider than that, and that the I think the post millennials view that the world's getting progressively better. Even when darkness appears to have its victory, with Jesus, Jesus already won the victory. Because here's the thing with martyrdom, right? Martyrdom being the worst possible thing, or the global wipe being the worst possible thing. We're looking at it from the earthly lens. Like there's a horrible car accident in my local town. 5 people or 3 people died just this past Saturday. It's tragic. And another example is my dad. One of his friends died of cancer recently at the age of 57. And when you think that this life is all you have, that becomes the worst imaginable thing possible. But when you actually radically believe that Christ had victory over not just Satan, but over death, death is a power that Satan uses on this world. He like when he thinks that he can back you down by threatening to cut your tongue out or cut your hand off or execute you or brutally whatever torture you. But Jesus showed faithfully to Simon Peter and to his apostles that no, there is anastasis, there is resurrection of the body. You'll be, no matter what happens to you now in the temporal time, you have an eternity waiting for you, right? You have renewed life after death. Not just a heavenly glory, but time will continue. The new Jerusalem will come down. We'll be in the New Jerusalem living with our God, and time will continue, and there will be probably more to do. Like it's not just sitting on a harp and playing a harp lesson on the clouds. Like there's going to be more work to be done, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, so basically Jesus dying, that symbolizes almost the worst thing that could happen, and the most power concentrated in Satan and evil, etc. But
yeah,
then Jesus' resurrection is symbolizing his future kingdom, that it's still more powerful than Satan, even though Satan seems almost infinitely powerful.
yeah, exactly. Satan seems infinitely powerful in the moment, in the present time, the temporal time. And that's why I say God's trying to ferry something out of us through this,
Mhm.
because we think death is the most important thing. But what God values something higher. His ways are not our ways, right? He values faith and love. Those are really more powerful and more valuable than death or life, even, or suffering. And it wasn't just that Jesus was an abstract representation of the resurrection. Christians believe, real Christians believe, that this was an event that happened. that it wasn't even symbolic. Like it was the real deal. It was an event in history that transpired. And when you realize that Satan uses death all the time to back us down and destroy our faith, then when we all sin, we sin. Probably even Maximus the Confessor says he was a sinner when he died. That we all have failures and we all fall down and we are sinful. And they say it's from corruption, from the original corruption of original sin. Some people say, how is it fair that since Adam sinned way back then, I'm now a sinner now? And you say, okay, maybe it's not fair. Maybe it isn't fair, but it's the way it is. It's the facticity of we're put into this world. And you'll realize that when you follow God, your life will improve, inevitably, like almost universally. You'll still suffer tragedy and setback, but the good will be pursued. And then, as it says, and it's not just pursuing an eschatological reward in heaven. You will see fruits in your life in the present moment, and you will be striving towards the good. And then, even if you suffer greatly, like what's more powerful than, let's say, the movie Braveheart, where he dies for a nation or a cause, right? You see how powerful that message was, that he died for his cause. It's even more true that when you die for Christ or you die for God, you're a martyr, that there's something that you've reached a transcendence at that point. Actually, Justin the Martyr and a bunch of Christians that were being executed with Justin the Martyr. I think that was accurate historically. I'm not sure on that though. Maybe someone could correct me, but I think Justin the Martyr, he wrote down that there was 20 or so Christians that were with him, and they all had their hands and tongues cut out or something, and then they said we're glad before they did. They said we're glad to be martyred for our God because it secures our spot
Yes.
in on the other side. So yeah. But I don't. I'm afraid that I don't even have. I think that maybe in 50 odd years, if I live that long, there could be Christianity like there could be laws against worshiping Christ and laws against worshiping God in our culture. Like it could progress that far if we let it go too far. Uh, but I don't even know if I have the internal strength in myself now to martyr or to be faithful the way Daniel was. Daniel's one of the best examples. Faithful into the lion's den. Faithful. His friends were faithful into the furnace. He was spared, but the idea is that, like with Ignatius, the martyr Ignatius of Loyola, that you will not be spared death necessarily. You may even suffer death, but you will, in that you have transcended. And then what happens after all the apostles die? The Spirit of Christ is poured out over all of Europe. Right? It's not perfect. It's Christendom. Doug Wilson calls it Christendom 1.0, and we're now entering Christendom 2.0. But the Holy Spirit is poured out over Europe, and now St. Peter's Square is one of the most glorified public spaces in all of Europe, right? So another example is, sorry to go on and on, but Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There is a man, sometimes in your own lifetime, you will see the fruits of what you did in your life, the authorship that you had in your life. Solzhenitsyn, saw a year after he died, his book was made standard curriculum reading, mandatory reading in Russian high school. Right? He actually put to death the regime that consigned him to the gulag. His words helped put the nail in the coffin. As he said, he wished that his cry would be heard by 200 million people, and it was. Sometimes he won't, or sometimes like Gregory the Great, the Pope to Gregory the Great, he on his deathbed thought that he had failed in every aspect of leading the church and leading the faith. But then reforms that he put in place preserved the church for another 500 years or so, or longer. So sometimes you'll see it, sometimes you won't see it. And sometimes it happens after your temporal existence on the earth. So.
Yeah, it's like Phoebe on Friends said, "I'd do anything not to be appreciated in my own time."
Yeah, that's good, eh?
Yeah, one last.
Doug Wilson said something. Doug Wilson said, I like him. He's really good. If you should watch him. He said, "I hope that the Wilson name disappears in the history. I don't want personal glory." Like, and I think that's definitely the right attitude to have. Yeah.
Yeah, I watched the Babylon Bee interview with him
Oh,
in
that was good.
preparation for
That was good.
this.
And that gets back to I just watched that too, and I think we had a similar question in our last interview, where you said what you didn't say this directly, but you might have said something like, What's the difference between cruciform theocracy and Sharia law? And I had an okay response, but Doug Wilson had a better response. Is that the religions are different. Islam is not the same religion as Christianity, right? They're not the same religion. Christianity is a religion by which tolerance was cultivated in the Anglo-Saxon world, at least. You know, so that's good that you watch. I'm excited.
Yeah, they have. I think we'll get to that soon.
Yeah.
Just one last question about the kind of Christian metaphysic. Do you and transitioning this over to the CTMU? Do you think that the kind of Father, Son, Holy Spirit could is is then borne out as the theory model universe that it's passing through all of these different stages?
The way that the theory, so you're saying, does it conform to the CTMU, or does it take shape into the CTMU? I think
Yeah,
that the answer, I wrote an article on this, is that philosophy is always a media. And this is the way Doug Wilson defines media as like a shovel is a media, a tool. Technology is a media. A tractor is a media. It's a media, a tool by which you can do work on the world. And I see most philosophy as falling into this category of being a media. And sometimes it's invaluable. Like sometimes the contribution is so valuable that it becomes a media that you couldn't conceive of the world without it. So like Einstein's theory of relativity, could we conceive the world without Einstein's theory of relativity or quantum theory? And then one day, hopefully, they'll be matched up. But in Langen's contribution, like Langen said of himself, he said his contribution was on par with Isaac Newton, and I don't know if he said this, but Einstein as well. So it's a paradigm shift. And if we are going to traverse the stars one day, then the CTMU will be something that will take on greater proportions if it's a philosophy of the future, which we believe it is. Right? It doesn't have to. It can take on theological proportions. Uh, the the question is, does the Father and Son comport into the model of the CTMU? I'd say maybe they do, but it doesn't have to happen that way. It doesn't have to be that way.
and then also in particular that the idea that the one has to trialize in order to identify itself. So you have theory as the father or creator, and then the universe as Jesus as the logos, which actually holds the universe together. And there's thus able to be an internal distinction within one ultimate identity.
Yeah. What was it? So to get back to the question of the one and the many, like played out, is there the one and the many? Are they the same or different? Uh, it's useful to explore these things. Like even Hegel said, like God's spirit incarnates. I don't agree with this, by the way, but Hegel said God drinks from the chalice that is his own infinitude, and then he incarnates as all the different humans on Earth. I don't agree with that. Sometimes philosophy is useful. The one is obviously useful. The one in the many is useful, or the one are like you were saying, trialic into three parts. It's some of these numbers. These numbers are given by God, by the way. Like I'm in connection with this guy that talked about. He did an analysis of pi and how it fits into the shape of a sphere, and then somehow matches up with the shape. I can't do justice to his theory, but shape of a box, and then pi. The number sequence is found somewhere in scripture. Uh, so when you believe God is God of the universe, I'm not very mathematically skilled myself, but you do realize that God is a mathematical God as well. He made the numbers. He made the natural laws, the physics, the strong, the weak forces, the gravitation, all these things. Uh, I think all philosophy is just humans coming to, like, since the Enlightenment, especially. Enlightenment was almost like a second fall, if you look at it that way. Like Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, gained knowledge of good and evil, and then he was kicked out of the garden. The Enlightenment was we gained knowledge into the laws of nature, and then the 20th century was Cain killing, like the 20th century was the totalitarians of the 20th century was Cain killing their brother Abel. Right? It's almost like a repetition of the story over across a societal level. It's quite You just see, like I say, you see the central cast recurring over and over again. These central stories recurring over and over again in history. But with the Enlightenment wasn't all bad. Sometimes it's good to understand the laws of nature. And I think with media, like I call these philosophies medias of thought, tools that we can work with. Language CTMU will be a media of thought that is required to make the next leaps in thought and leaps in stages, higher, almost dialectical. I want to say dialectical leaps, although I don't know if Lang is necessarily a fan of dialectical thinking. Anyways, yeah.
So ultimately, you'd say that we can have human descriptions of God, but like ultimately, God is just God.
Yeah, God is just God. God gives you his word to make. And this is something that, with God, Pastor Vodi Balsham says that you don't have to contemplate the whole mystery to be saved. So our mind, it says the Jews seek after a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom. It's kind of the same thing. Like they seek after gnosis or knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with knowledge in itself. And honestly, faith can be gotten by knowledge. I've seen many people say they've come to God through the CTMU, which is great. I'm sure Langdon is thrilled when he hears that. Or Pearson says people come to God through him. But it's a media of thought, and it is logos when you think of it as human logos. So the CTMU is the encapsulation of all human logos, right? I think that's what Langen means when he says the CTMU is logos. He doesn't mean the CTMU is Christ. I may be wrong in this, but he doesn't say the CTMU is Christ. And we should get away from the language, like you said in your video on panentheism, of in itself, or like, the distinction that Kant made, in itself or by its own right. But there's a sense in which the CTMU doesn't have to be Christ. It can be a media of thought, but it is human logos encapsulated, I believe.
Just a question you answered this two last two questions ago. Was the person you were in correspondence with, was that digital archaeology?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. He's good. He hasn't got back to me, but yeah, he's good. I think. I'm not a math guy, so I can't apprise these things as well as maybe a philosophy or a humanities perspective.
Yeah,
He's a good channel.
yeah, it's interesting. I don't know about the thesis, but it's interesting if it is true
Hmm.
that there are basically scriptural references in pi and it corresponds to different passages in the Bible, which reveals
Yeah.
something important.
If that's true,
And
it's,
also,
it's it's an amazing discovery. If it's true, I think he's done a very compelling job of formulating a video that kind of shows that. Uh, I would like to see further corroboration, maybe.
yeah. And it's also interesting because it's based on the numerical value of Hebrew words in the Bible.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool, eh?
Yes, I put it in my box of things. Interesting if true.
Yeah, that's a good box to have. Yeah,
Yeah. Where would kind of human causation come in your view? Because if you look at society, etc., you see this marvelous structure and all of these systems, which I know weren't created directly by God, like a city or a building,
yeah,
etc., but seems like it requires the same kind of designing intelligence and higher order coherence.
yeah. Now, there was a sense to which we got into the last video that we said that Jesus hands out logo or logoi or logi. It's pronounced Logoi. Uh, so humans, and I wrote an article on this. They said that humans are handed logoi. I call it logo. It should be pronounced logi. Orthodox guys will get mad at me for that. But I call it logoi. Its logo is plural, and it's almost like grace. So any knowledge that's gotten, and I'm not one of those ones that says that I'm not like a super strict Protestant that talks about total depravity and the fact that humans are totally bad and there's no good in them. I think God actually likes people that are good to begin with, and then He selects them. I'm not. When you get too dogmatic and you start saying like I'm a Calvinist or I'm a strict Orthodox or I'm a strict this, strict that, it erects barriers, rigid barriers where there shouldn't be. I'm a very open personality. I like flow of ideas. I like openness. Uh, so where do these systems come from? Both the natural endowment that man is given with speech, with the logi, and then the grace through God. That's where I think they come from. And you'll notice that a lot of the great guys that like Immanuel Kant and I think Hegel was purportedly a Christian. Like they're all purportedly Christian, right? They may have weird ideas that conflict with the Christianity of their time, but they at least believe in God. So these systems, and there's the great Western system builders, right? There's Immanuel Kant. There's and then the critiquers of the system, Heidegger, and then there's Lange as a whole new system that's reverberated in the 20th century. We're one thing about Westerners is that we're great Judeo-Christian West is that we're great system builders. This is, and I love systems. I love thinking in systems. I love people that erect good systems, and Langen does this in spades. A whole new, like it's called. I just figured out why it's called Angkor because of a new kind of reality theory. I didn't know what the acronym stood for. And I'm like, oh, okay. That's. I looked at the front of the cover. And I'm like, oh, Angkor. Okay. Uh, yeah. How do? So your question was how God isn't he's the primary cause, but all these things that happen in on Earth are products of human. That's true. Like a rocket isn't built without scientists,
Yeah.
right? And this is why I was getting kind of a debate with somebody in my Bible study, and they were saying that it's all Christ does everything. And I was kind of disagreeing on saying no, we participate in Christ's victory, and and God does. If we didn't have anything to do, how would God decide who's the wheat and the chaff? Like you have to do. And then in Revelations, this is where the Protestants get it wrong again. I'm beating up my own denominate my own religion, but it's good. You got to box these things, box them out. But what was I gonna say? God, there is wheat from chaff, and God is trying to ferry something out, and He's trying to. I think He selects good people. I think and there's the dividing line between good and evil, and you have to select every day whether you're going to do good. Like Solzhenitsyn said, the line runs on the heart of every human being, and we do. And then that's what I'm saying. Revelation, Book of Revelations, uh, against the Protestant at work in the end of Revelation, I think chapter 20 or 21 or maybe 19, it says, "Then the books will be opened, and they will see the works that every man has done, that every soul has done, and then the book of life will be opened." So there's the book of life, which kind of is the book of everything, and then there's the books that will be opened up, and it could be the books on our bookshelf. Like you don't know what books they're talking about. Are they going to print a whole bunch of new books, or are they going to be books that exist already in our printed world? It's kind of a funny idea to finagle with, but there is works. There is works. Now it's done by faith, but faith without works is dead. So where does that get you?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a major idea in Langen kind of talking about at least politically, that God has intrinsic ends but needs human beings to choose to fulfill them. That's the purpose of free will, is this triumph of the human spirit.
I think JFK, John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address said, "God's work must truly be our own." And it might have been from Isaiah that he pulled that from. I'm not sure. Yep. Oh yeah, yeah. God definitely. Like if that's the Protestant, it goes too far. It's too Calvinist, too radical, and then it says that there's absolutely nothing that humans do. It's all faith, and then it's all grace, and it's all Christ and God. And I don't believe that, because even people that go to work, why are you working? Why do you go to work? Why do you go to a job? Why do you go to school? Why do you go to worship? Maybe you could just say, I believe in Jesus, and then that'd be the end of the story. There is a daily activity, and God told man that he would have to work for whatever reason God gave. I think it's for the good. And like it says in Revelations, the books will be opened up, and the books will contain what you did day to day. Like not for everybody to see, but the books will contain what did this person do, or what did this person think, or what did this person believe. What was their faith? It was written in this book. I love that idea. I'm a bookish person. I love that idea that the books will be opened up, and the book of life will finally be opened up and contain everything.
Yeah. It's also interesting that if you think about like the best thinkers throughout kind of human history, they're all like almost Christian, but kind of have a kind of idiosyncratic or
Yeah.
more
Oh,
eccentric
that's good.
view.
That's a good observation. Yeah, that's absolutely
Y-
true.
Yeah, like Isaac Newton, I know was an Arian, which is like a heresy from like the third century, and I
Yeah,
think Chris Langan would be included in that class as
yeah.
well.
And I was thinking about this too. It's like, does dogmatic purity equal what God is really looking for? Does God want Chris Langan to comport to what the Nicene Creed said? Absolutely, he might do this, but does he have to follow the church history and do everything on doctrinal purity that the church declared this was a heresy? So if you're doing this heresy, then you're not saved. Uh, and people often get ideas in their head and they'll say things and they're speaking the ideas of a man that's been dead for hundreds of years. They'll say like, "Oh, sola scriptura," or sola fide, or sola, which is sola, faith alone, or grace alone, or Christ alone, or they'll do the five tulip points of John Calvin, which is total depravity, unconditional elect, limited atonement, uh, to the perseverance of saints, irresistible grace. You can't be too. I'm When I took Pearson's personality course, I scored like 99th percentile in openness, even though I'm conservative. Because people that are dogmatic, I accept them for what they are, but it can be too much sometimes. And I think a lot of us guys that are working with the C team, you are a lot more open. It doesn't map perfectly with intelligence, but it is a marker of intelligence that you're open. But you were saying, what were you saying again? You were saying that, yeah, that Chris Langan might be considered a heretic by the standards of the past, and that he could be considered a heretic by the standards of today's time. But maybe God isn't trying to might make everybody the same or ferry out to this identic dogmatic stance.
Yeah, that's Chris Langan, I remember in his interview with Michael Knowles, which is tragically never published.
Yeah.
But he said he was talking about his theory of kind of the distinction between Satan and Lucifer, and he was like, your Catholic Church would say I'm a heretic for this, but
Yeah, I watched that on the Substack. It was good. I did that review video on it. Very good.
yeah.
Uh, so he's a heretic. Yeah, he's a heretic. So what are we gonna do about it? Nothing.
But then also, if you think like John Calvin, Martin Luther,
They were
these were
heretics.
people who were directly attacking not only the precepts of the church, but the church itself.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, they were heretics, and people today I made a video on John Calvin. They're like, John Calvin's a heretic, and they said that, and it's like, okay, so 500 years later, we're still on the same subject. I think that N.T. Wright's my favorite reformer of the 21st century, and he says we need to be asking. I said this in the last interview. We need to be asking 21st century questions. No longer must we stick in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century and be Protestant versus Catholic. And this is the old man, like the old Adam. This is the old man that should die away. The new man should come up. And the new man, and like Doug Wilson even says, Christendom 2.0. Because Christendom 1.0, the span from the end to the end of the 20th century had so many issues. Although it's not as bad as atheism, mind you, because the Spanish Inquisition killed, like he said, killed 2,000 people over 200 years, whereas Stalin killed like millions of people within the span of 5 years or 10 years. So there's no comparison in the culpability and the guilt, and yet we with our values that we have today, the value of humanity and humanism, not always a bad thing. Humanism, valuing life, but they should be a Christian or a religious or a godly pursuit rather than the atheist secularist pursuit that they've taken it to be.
Yeah. What were your you mentioned you had notes prepared on the CTMU.
I wasn't sure if Jonathan was going to be on, but I have four questions. And the first one is somebody on my channel said the CTMU lacks a person, lacks modeling a person. divine or otherwise. And it says, persons and personhood comprise reality. Can a person even be modeled? And I had an answer for that prepared, and that the CTMU identifies with the structure of syntactic operators. So Langan does say that I don't, I can't, I personally probably can't articulate very well what CTM's use model of a person is, but Langan does include personhood and personality in the CTMU. I think that's evident. And then the other points were, so that was the first point. Is a question actually, and I'll put it to you actually too. Does the CTMU lack a person?
Well, I would say no, because what it's saying is that the ultimate identity of reality is not a thing, it's it's a person fundamentally. It's God with internal private consciousness, etc., who also identifies himself with the
Yeah,
structure of human beings, etc. I've actually described people think reality is objective. This is what's his face? The the founder of sentient singularity theory says reality. Tyler Goldstein, that reality is actually super subjective. That it's these interlaced perspectives of all these different people, and then
yeah,
God is identifying himself with the structure of that.
yeah,
Chris Langan says in his video God and Emotions that God is actually experiencing consciousness in a certain sense through his creation and
yeah,
observer participation
yeah.
throughout time.
So when the CTMU is modeling a person, you're saying, I'm not saying put words in your mouth. Are you saying that God is that person and then we are those persons? And does it say this explicitly in the CTMU paper, the Anchor paper, or is this only attributable to statements that Langan made on certain videos?
He says this, I don't have the exact thing, in a paper he wrote before the Anchor paper in on the CTMU, I think from the late 1990s. He says that in a self-perceptual universe where you have all these different people who are making perceptions and observing and creating reality, then the identity of that must necessarily be a constructive, personal, creative intelligence, which is allowing that to exist and is thus the creator and king of all being.
Wow. You should send me that paper after we're done here, or link it in the description because I love to read that. That's very well answered, Tommy. Uh,
One more thing
yeah,
about that. I was watching Jonathan Pajot was discussing this with I don't know who the other guy was, but basically what he said is that our fundamental experience of reality is personal. It's experiencing conscious experience through the lens of a person. So
yeah,
why would we assume that the image of the infinite, if that's how you want to define God, is just an idea or a concept? It only makes sense that that would be a person as well.
yeah,
If we're made in the image of God, that's a two-way correspondence. That God is also, in a sense, in the image of generalized personhood, and
yeah.
he identified that with Christ as well.
Well, you're better prepared for these questions than I was. Yeah, that's very good. Very good. Karl Barth said something like, "The relationship to God is personal." As we all know, the saying, "the personal God." But he says the movement between Father, Son, and believer, and Holy Spirit is all personalized. It's all personal. And then even when it comes to fascism, almost everything humans do is personal. Julius Evola, I don't know if you know him, but he's a traditionalist thinker, and he says that fascism is a personal rule or a personal thing. It's a dictator. That's a person ruling over the state. Right.
Yeah. One moment.
Yep.
My computer is almost dead. Can I just pause
Yep.
the recording just for 1 minute and get a charger? We are back.
Good. I was thinking with the CTMU compatriots thing that we're doing. I think we can be open about what we're doing.
Hmm.
Uh, it's supposed to be. It's not meant to be secretive. It's just meant to be at work communications thing. Uh, in Rick and Morty, Rick said Rick in season, I think season 2 or season 1, Rick is taken before the council of Ricks, and he's like, "You hated the government so much, you became a stupid government." And I just think, I hope it's funny that just certain things bounce around in your head. You're like, "Are we becoming a stupid government, or
Hope not.
no? We're gonna." This is the council of Ricks, the council of CTMU compatriots.
Yeah. This is, or do you want to continue with that, or should we do other other topics, just like what you had, or what?
I can keep going with. I had 4 points. That was the first point was about the personhood. Um, and then number 2 was about. I'm really trying to get to fundamentals and even trying to refine my own fundamental understanding of the CTMU. The second point was language is all, and by this I had defines the very structure of information. Cognition, perception are languages based on what Kant might have called phenomenal syntax. And then I have that quote from the CTMU dialogue, which says, "Mental structure shapes the phenomenal world," and has been known since Kant. So that was the second one, was that language is all. I think when you're talking with people about the CTMU, the biggest hurdle that they have generally from the comments I've received is they say, reality is not language, that's stupid. That's nonsense, that's ridiculous. And they don't consider it with any depth or with any reflection. Uh, but Lang is calling like so many things. I don't know. This is a question that I eventually have is I don't know if he calls matter and information a language. I'm not sure on that point. He calls cognition and perception a language, and he says that they define the very structure of information. So even though information and matter are really isomorphic, uh, cognition I think, transduces information into infocognitive monism, which is then the currency of perception and cognition. So maybe you could weigh in. What do you think about, because it says he's trying to provide the conceptual framework between the relationship of matter, information, cognition, and perception. Those 4 things.
Yeah, well, there's an important thing in the CTMU and court paper, the new kind of reality theory, which I should probably link in the description if we've mentioned it this much,
Yeah.
is in one of the footnotes, it's hidden. He says, "Mi- Mind and matter are identical up to isomorphism, but past that, mind outstrips matter." So
I
it
was
is
saying this. I was saying
actually,
this on the phone with my dad today. Actually, I was like, "The mind outstrips matter, Dad." And he's like, "Okay." Yeah, I remember that fun though. I took a note of that one too. Yeah,
yeah, so there
mental
are,
outstrips. Yeah.
oh, good.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
All right, yeah, so there are materials, but ultimately, even past that, and materials are an aspect of mind, so you can't really separate the two. It's
Mm,
not like a Cartesian mind matter dualism,
yeah.
but mind is ultimately the most fundamental because reality is a mind fundamentally. It's God's mind.
Yeah.
And also the point about reality being a language, I think the confusion is mostly people don't really understand the definition of a language in modern logic, mathematics, philosophy, etc. That it's not just English, French, Spanish, it's any identification about reality is qualified as a language. So that's cognition, perception, mathematics, logic, etc. are
Mm,
all languages. And you also have to think like I'm using English and I can describe concepts. Why is there any relationship between my description of reality and reality itself
yeah.
if reality isn't identifying itself?
Can you quickly, for yourself, of your own understanding, define what a language is?
I would say I don't know the technical definition that Lang uses, but some basic ingredients would be making identifications and attributions about reality, so that's including within a formal system, and having a unique set of syntax, grammar, rules for the transformations of states within what you're describing.
Yeah.
So this is why physics is a different language from biology. But then the most general language is natural language, because anything which can be expressed in another language can be expressed in English, basically.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking the same thing because you said identification, which could be called semantics. So the definition of a word, the semantics of the word, is the identification. This is the location and definition of the word, and then like you said, syntax. So language is generally a state and syntax. And I got this most clearly from the CTMUS video on the introduction to Lang and CTMU. He says he divided it into state and syntax, and syntax is like like you were saying, the structure, the ordering of symbols, and then semantics is the identification or the location of a word where it locates and maps out into reality. So that's good. It's good. Sometimes you talk to a person and you wonder if they can define the most fundamental idea, like what is a woman, like that with the transgender movement. What is a woman? For us, we need to really emphasize what is a language, right? Fundamentals. What is a language?
Yes. Well, don't you know a woman is someone who identifies as a woman?
Was that right?
That's all.
Wonder how that fits into the
So
CTMU.
it's a super tautology.
Yeah.
That's all it
Oh,
calls on itself.
yeah.
So it generates existence.
Oh,
But
yeah. Funny.
I, I'd also say, actually, I don't recall what I was going to say. You
Uh,
can
yeah.
go.
So that was the second point, was that language is all, and like we said, people, like you said, people have a struggle saying reality is a language because they don't know what the definition is. We just defined it. So when you think about even let's take a field or a forest. This forest is, like you're saying, natural language, follows a lot. It's a matter of information, but it's also a language distributes over it, or it is a language itself, because it's a topological distribution of trees. If you looked at it from a bird's eye view, it would map out quite clearly. This is the structure of it, and that could either, I don't know if you'd call it, I think you would call that syntax. The structure of the forest is a syntax, the ordering of the symbols and signs in the language, and then each individual tree is a semantical definition. So you got the topological and then the semantical, and sometimes this gets confusing even for us who work on it. It gets confusing. We don't have the mental acuity that Langen has sometimes, but if we can work through collectively the fundamentals of Langen's thought, I think that's very valuable. So for people that don't think reality is a language, first of all, Heidegger said reality is a language. Peterson says reality is a language. And Peterson is undervalued as a philosopher. He's actually a very good philosopher too. His book Maps of Meaning, and people don't read it, but it's actually brilliant. Uh, but Peterson says, and he said it in his talk on logos at Ephesus. He called this talk. He said that first of all, you assign value and then hierarchy, valence, then value, valence and value. Uh, Valence of what action you can take towards an object, and then value in a hierarchy of what that object is worth to you. And Langen would, I think, he would call this part of cognition and perception. And he would say this itself has a structure of a language. And this is where I always get to. I say when I look at that lamp, my language distributes onto that lamp. I say the lamp is on, and that's in English. English distributes over my lamp. English or French, or if you know statistics, then you can distribute statistics over reality or mathematics or anything you use. But like Heidegger said, language is a house of being, and like I said, language is proofs this, right? So it's where people get hung up because I've had many comments where people say this is nonsense. Reality is not a language, but
Mm.
all great philosophers have said this essentially.
Yeah, the Peterson gets a lot of slack for this, is always going on about postmodernism, etc.
Mm.
But he's bringing about a really important point, is that you need a set of intuitions, of guiding principles to have you make sense of any experience of reality, or else it's all just facts
Yeah.
and there's nothing to interpret it in.
And what do we see with postmodernism is that they have a breakdown of fundamental language. They have a breakdown of logic. When they see a Hispanic man in the Proud Boys, they say that he's internalizing white supremacy. Like their language doesn't, their ideology and their language is all corrupted and dyslexic almost, and unorganized. And postmodernism was a rejection of grand narratives. A narrative is a story that it contains, that is a language itself. And when you reject the grand narrative, when you reject the stories, or you create stories that don't, this is a thing in language terminology I came up against too, is that does Langan hold a spot for descriptions of reality that are produced by a mind but that don't make coherent sense? Like, what does Langan say about things that are nonsense in language, like babbling, or calling a woman a man or whatever? What does he make of incoherent statements?
Oh, I actually do know this, that essentially he discusses this problem of the statement, this sentence is a lie. Because if it's true, then it's a lie. And if it's a lie, then it's true. And what he basically says is that if it can't be registered in the syntax, in the rules and structure of logic, which is, of course, means it can't be true, and it can exist in a non-terminal domain in the space of potential, but it can't have any actual instantiation, and so you can kind of exclude it from reality.
That's really good. I was just thinking when you're saying that, that's a good explanation. I was thinking when I point to that chair and say to my friend, go sit in that chair, that makes sense and that distributes over reality. It's logical and it's coherent. And then when the chair's not there and I say the same thing, I say go sit in that chair, but there's no chair there, that breaks down. It breaks down immediately. And the person will be confused. They'll say, uh, I think that just exists in your mind.
Yeah. The Also, one more point about language is there's this book I read called On Language by Noam Chomsky. I didn't really read it. I read like a few pages. It was one of the most boring things I've ever read in my
Oh,
life.
yeah. Yeah,
Um, but
yeah.
he does make an important point from what I got from it is he has this theory of transformational grammar that you have, and of course he doesn't. Langdon actually relates that he was on an email distribution with him and just couldn't grasp the concept that reality is a language. But within his own language theory, it actually,
Chomsky couldn't grasp that?
yeah,
Oh,
that he
really?
had correspondence with Langdon in like the 90s.
Really?
But but his theory of language is actually basically what Lenin is saying about reality, which is that there's this base syntax, this rules and structure, and then when you're generating sentences, you're actually applying a transformation on that base syntax, and
No.
this is why you have to have free will because you're actually generative. You can't be determined by something because there's nothing to determine that in the
No.
rules and structure of reality.
As Lang says with the self simulation, he says that the generative processes and the simulation and generation have to distribute over the actualization. Like a person has to simulate their own reality because otherwise a computer would have to process, generate, and then actualize, and it can't do that without touching reality. And so if it was a computer, it couldn't touch upon the specific localized areas to actualize, and it could generate, but it couldn't actualize, and it could actualize, but it couldn't generate together into one. I think I might be confusing some of the terms there, but I think that was the gist of it. So it's funny that Chomsky. Oh, that's funny. I like that because I like beating up Chomsky. So that's good. Uh, like Langan says, most scientists can't formulate, and this is very critical for all of us in the CTMU. Most scientists can't formulate the epistemic force of their science. Even like professors that don't know that, even let's say a professor that's a philosophy of knowledge doesn't know what Langan knows about isomorphism, languages being the structure of reality, distributing over reality, matter and information, how they interact with cognition and perception. The framework, like you said, of matter, information, cognition, and perception. If you don't have the whole enchilada of the CTMU, then you don't have a strong epistemic. Like David Hume debated this, Berkeley debated this, Immanuel Kant debated this, uh, and then Lenin chimed in against Hume and Berkeley, of course. But people have been, until now, I think that Langen finally provides the epistemic force of metaphysics, which is maybe the most, maybe, I'm not saying this for sure, but maybe his most important contribution. I have further points, unless you had directed to more. Uh,
No, go ahead.
so, lang- so the last point was language is all. This third point is language is paramount. Cognition and perception as languages transduce information. And I just recently learned what transducing means. It actually means transforming, right? Like conveying and transforming. So cognition, perception as languages transduce information, where information is up to isomorphic with concrete matter. And then my question was transduce into what? And I thought it had to be into infocognition. I thought that cognition and perception as languages had to transduce information and matter into infocognition, right? Don't know what you think about that. Do you think that's correct, or is there a different way to view it?
Could you repeat the question?
So, what do you think that the languages of perception and cognition, what do they transduce information into?
Well, I think there, I think the end result is information. If you look at quantum mechanics, this is John Wheeler's observer participation thesis that reality, the universe, when you're not looking at it, exists as almost this tapestry of potentiality, and then your perception or cognition that you're distributing over it is then transforming that into information, which is actually organizing energy. Chris
Oh,
Langan says telesis is a generalization of energy and information. The information is telling the energy how to configure. So when
mm,
you're looking at something or thinking about it, you're participating in its creation.
yeah. There was a part in Langen's Sheet Anchor where he said that sometimes people that say everything is information don't realize that it has the same problems as saying everything is matter, or everything is matter. They say that everything is information, but they don't find the same irreducible gap between information and mind. So I think that, and like you said, which a good point that I hadn't considered was that the mind is matter too. Obviously, the mind is matter too. Another point that he said was that DNA, a protein of DNA, is material, and it's a material transducer of information. We know that it's a strain of protein, but it does everything. It creates language, creates your eye color, creates your characteristics, right? So maybe I was being too simplistic when I considered the question, but I thought that that cognition and perception as languages had to transduce information and matter into infocognition. This critical monism that Lang talks about, this currency of abstract perception, is infocognition. So when you talk about the way that we perceive something or cognize something, we cognize information, but we cognize it as infocognition.
Yeah, well, this is Langen's criticism of Immanuel Kant that when you're talking about a noumena, something which is stripped of all of its phenomenal qualities, what you're basically saying is that it's an uninterpreted interpretation. So there's no meaningful concept of that. So again, it can be excluded from reality. So when our so if it Langen says that which cannot be described or conceived does not merit inclusion in the sort of reality that we're studying.
Yeah.
Maybe it exists in some space of potential or some 100,000 IQ gigachad can figure out what that means. But for the purpose of
Yeah.
reality theory, there's no real meaning to that statement. It's absurd. It's like x equals not x.
Yeah, very good. I was thinking about this too. Is the other day was that there's different, let's call them chronotypes of men, and I've noticed that the Giga Chad or the that's funny. Langan is like a muscle man, and usually the different dividers is, oh, muscular guys aren't smart. But I was thinking, no, sometimes they're the smartest guys, the guys that have the big muscles. Or there's more of the Christ-like smart guy, which is more like he's not hyper masculine, but he's masculine and he's not androgynous. But what's another word? Like he's in tune with his feminine side, which is like who's like that? Christ is like that. I think that Aragorn from Lord of the Rings is like that. And so there's a great video on saying that he's the ideal form of masculinity because he's in tune with poetry and music, and he has long hair and he has a light beard. So there's this hyper masculine guy. There's different chronotypes, and sometimes it's hard to say who's the smartest. But I think muscle men are discounted. Giga chads are discounted sometimes, but they shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you think abstractly. I know I'm now trying to make a symbol out of something that literally exists, but I think existence is symbolic. Is that that's almost like the union between mind and body of someone who, well, I mean, Lincoln's not the strongest person in the world,
Yeah.
but he is arguably the smartest person in the world. But there's that union of the two, which you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Didn't Aristotle say that any man that hasn't um, exercised the full potential of his body is not in touch with his self? Something like
Yeah.
that. I think that was the quote.
Yeah, so if you believe that mind and body or mind and matter are essentially identical, then that makes sense of that archetype.
Yeah, good. Just a little peccadillo that I had to sort out there. Thanks for helping me. So what else do I have? So language is paramount. What did I have written here? So there was two characteristics, two novel features of the CTMU paradigm. The one was a global, structural, and dynamic reflexivity, self-excited circuitry with perception as integral. So the first part of the CTMU is that it satisfies John Archibald Wheeler's self-excited circuit, and that's perception. And you were saying that the universe is perceptual in nature, that it activates as being perceived, and that was like the double slit experiment that Wheeler. I'm reading the autobiography of Wheeler. You should get that. It's called. You should read that if you haven't already. Uh, like on Geon's black holes, and it's the autobiographical book by John Wheeler where he covers all his findings in his career. So first of all, we have the self-excited circuit, which is perception, and then the second novel feature of the CTMU was matter information equivalence and identification up to isomorphism, where concrete physical reality is isomorphic with information in the abstract currency of perception. So those were the two sides: perception, self-excited circuitry, perception, and he says this early on in the Anchor paper, and then information and matter are isomorphic, identification up to isomorphism. So with all that, if people can grasp, so I feel like if people can grasp those two characteristics, and then on top of that they can characterize language perception as a language, they can get really far into the CTMU. Uh, and then of course the linchpin of the CTMU is the self-configuring, self-processing language, the SCSPL, which is in the introduction, Langan. I have that as a final point. The highest language is self-configuring, self-processing language. These are the fundamentals that if you're looking for fundamentals in the CTMU, you have to understand those characteristics: perception as a language and self-excited circuitry, and then matter information up to isomorphic identification. And then the highest language is a self-configured, self-processing language, which can almost be described as what you said earlier as a natural language, right? Like the world is a self-configuring, so the reality. It says the CTMU says reality is a self-configuring, self-processing language, as you had mentioned earlier, with a natural language, the way that the laws of nature distribute over a forest or a house or a city or a country. It's exciting. I think that with effort and with the concerted minds, and we'll have to gain more converts, not just compatriots, but just general audience members to convert to the CTMU or to learn about the CTMU. And we have to spread it as the intellectual dark web would have it. And I think that in 5 years' time, there could be a conference in the States somewhere of maybe 100 people or maybe 200 people, and then it could grow from there. I think if we do believe that it's a philosophy of the future, there's no reason to think that it wouldn't be. And I don't want to call us like the Marxists, because we're not like the Marxists. But you know how the Marxists were all Hegelian, and they associated and had these big foundations and associations. Uh, this is how movements are made, and we don't want to become like the globalists. We don't want to become like the government, but a free association of renegades, like how I like to think of us.
Yeah, and I mean the Marxists, they were very effective. They got several countries,
Yeah,
but
it was
it,
the ideas where it failed. It wasn't in the legwork that failed. It was the ideas that failed, right?
yeah,
Uh,
I mean, I was reading
yeah,
the Communist Manifesto, and it's described, and in the beginning, it talks about, they had this big conference of Marx and Engels and all these people and got together to
yeah,
publish this and translate it into English and French and German and Russian and
yeah,
got all these ideas out very quickly.
yeah, yeah. It's not a bad thing to associate when the ideas are truthful, connected to truth. They thought theirs was, but they were atheists and they were materialists. We have a more holistic understanding. There's a division. McGilchrist talks about the left brain versus the right brain. How the West has gone too much to the analytical left brain rather than the holistic right brain. Langan combines the two. He's very analytical, but he also sees the big picture. And we are believers in God, so we have faith on our side. We have truth on our side, and if we believe that the CTMU is as important as we purport to be in our talking, then there's no reason to think that we shouldn't be running a foundation or an association whereby we spread the CTMU. I couldn't translate it myself in any other language. I don't speak any other languages, and it'd be very difficult to. English is a highly analytical language, right? Remember, a guy said this. He said Russian is a poetic language. English is an analytical language. Uh, but yeah, that they were effective. The legwork was effective. It was the ideas that were faulty. We want our ideas and our legwork to be effective, I think.
Yeah, in the limited kind of CTMU community on YouTube, elsewhere, this could at most be said to consist of 5 to 10 people ish. How do you think that we could improve?
We're already in motion. The video we're doing today is in motion. It's activity in motion. It's the legwork. We have to win. I've made a video called that millennials, and even Zoomers are idealist. There's a return. I call it the postmodern return of idealism. We live on the internet. I live on. I didn't used to live on the internet. I lived before the internet was big. I was 13 or 12 or whatever. But I now have since lived on the internet. We are an idealist society, the millennialists. I think we've rightly moved away from materialism, into idealism, and so CTMU can win that battle. But we don't want to discount materialism altogether, because, like, Alan Watts had a great video where he said the Americans are the least materialistic society in the world, because everything they say is abstract. They go to school, they read books, they learn mathematics, but they don't cook a decent meal. There's a we don't love matter. We don't love matter. We should love matter, because matter is part of creation. So it's not to discount matter, but it's to discount materialism, the ism
Yeah,
attached to matter. But we can win the idea because we have God on our side, and we have ideas on our side. Idealism. And CTMU, with God at its back, is the media. We're saying the media of the future.
yeah. And I think also getting kind of like big projects, like if you look at the amount of people you're actually reading. You're actually reaching both you and I. A big chunk of our views on our channels are from like a handful of videos. This
Yeah,
is I was watching Mr. Beast on the Lex Friedman podcast, and he says, it's much easier to get 10 million views on one video than 100,000 views on 100.
yeah,
Because if you make a really good video,
yeah,
YouTube just keeps recommending it 2 years, 3 years down the
yeah,
line.
yeah. It's the same as what Pearson talked about with the Pareto distribution. How with Coca-Cola, their one product, Coca-Cola, is 80% of their revenue. It's a law that distributes to accumulation of wealth, to power in societies, to the size of cities, the way fungus grows on a tree, you know. Uh, and it's true with me. Like my top three videos are half of my views. The most on the CTMU. Uh, sorry, my neighbors are arguing or something. uh, see, no, yeah, and my CTMU guide for dummies seems to be the one that's really taken off.
Mm,
And it was crazy over that last month. And here's another point: is that most of my viewers are either millennials or Zoomers. There's very few over the age of 40. And that gets back to my thought that mathematics is a young man's game. Philosophy is a young man's game, as you're proving. Uh, thinking, concentration of thought is a young man's game. And then as you get older, you're supposed to get more interconnected, more relationships build, and then more interwoven connections between fields are derived when you're older. But in terms of pure concentration and focus on a goal, when you're 18 to 27, when your testosterone's at its peak, that's when your concentration is at its peak.
yeah.
But in terms of spreading it, in terms of spreading the CTMU to different people, uh, like even Langen's Facebook group has 4.6 thousand members.
Mhm.
Uh, but are we arguing about sheer size of the audience currently in this year? Or are we looking at potential in 5 years' time of the audience size? And then we're also saying the potential is directly related to the power of the ideas,
Mhm.
right? Power of the CTMU as an idea set is directly related to the size of the audience in the future. And
Yeah.
it will be the intellectual dark web. It will be an informal association of renegades. And like Steve Bannon says, when you have an immovable core, then you convince a larger group to follow along. Not follow
Yeah.
along, but be open to your ideas.
Yeah, I remember I saw a comment on a CTMU video called from CTMU Radio on whether Langan believes in an impersonal or personal God. And it was a comment from the Mathematical Metaphysics channel that, you know, this video should have 100 million views.
Yeah.
And then it ends with maybe one day it will.
Yeah.
Because we're not just thinking, a month, a year down the line, it's 10, 20, 30
Yeah.
years, even longer.
Oh yeah. I think you can only think in 5 year. I've heard that you can only think in 5 year horizons because
Mhm.
the world changes so rapidly in 5 years, especially in our times, that you can't conceive what 10 years is going to look like. But five, let's make a 5 year. That sounds bad. A 5 year plan, like Stalin. A 5 year plan. Uh, that's a good quote by Bernard, Mathematical Metaphysics. And even Langen's channel only has 15,000 YouTube subscribers, whereas I see YouTube has various other philosophers like Plastic Pills or Epoch Philosophy or Then and Now, which have 60,000 subscribers, 100,000 subscribers. Uh, but we're not like I said, we're not arguing the size of the audience today. We're arguing the power of the ideas today, and then in 5 years, the size of the audience will follow.
Mhm.
But it takes our effort. Like we have to participate in the victory.
Yeah, I remember Langan on his podcast with Keith Wood said basically, I've provided the foundational language of reality, and now we need basically a new priest class to interpret and disseminate this information.
That's what we
So,
are, brother.
who, who's fluent in this language?
I'm glad he said that. I'm glad that he sees it that way because I feel like we are. that priesthood, so to speak. But we have to be informal renegades. I think that's an important part of our character. We associate, but we're not after world domination or trying to capture government or trying to capture. We're not after this. We're after the power of the ideas. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good. That's a good place to. You have anything further?
Uh, yeah, this is sort of an abstract question, but it bears on what we were talking about before. It's like, what would your ideal world look like? I remember I was watching a Twitch stream with Destiny and Nick Fuentes, and it's funny because they're like the exact
Hmm.
opposite on politics. And he asks, what's like the end? What is like, what would your ideal world like? And he says, when pressed on it, he's like, I want a Catholic monarchy with the Pope basically as a one world government leader. And I
Yeah,
thought, well, that doesn't seem quite
that's
right.
not good.
But
That's not good. No, Doug Wilson is one that I had to lean on for this. It's not. It's okay to lean on other thinkers. It comes with the territory. We're limited in our thought. So when I come to an answer, I have to lean on Doug Wilson. So Doug Wilson says, it'd be like that. What do you call it? You watch the same interview, but he said like hyperon or hyperin, where there's separation between church and state, but it's not to protect the state from the church. It's to protect the church from the state. There's separation of church and state, and there's no enforced denomination. But I do believe it should be a Christian nation, at least, because in a Christian nation, by the way, that's where plurality came from. That's where the neutral public square came from. The toleration in America, at least, and in Canada and in Britain, it came from a Christian nation. So I don't want a monarchy. I want something like the American Republic, and I want something that reflects Christian values, at least, because like he says, law is the imposition of morality, and you'll have the imposition of morality from atheists and from secularists. But wouldn't you rather have a Christian elected Christian government and this may not happen today. It will probably require an outpouring of the Spirit of God, a great awakening to do. But wouldn't you rather have a Christian democratic government elected and a Christian nationalist? It can go by nation, but then Christian nations cooperate with each other democratically.
mhm,
That's why Doug Wilson. If you're looking for my opinion, I'm just going to mirror Doug Wilson, a Christian nation, and that embodies the values of toleration and plurality and multiple. It doesn't ban other faiths. It doesn't force people to convert. It's not Sharia law. It's not the same religion as Sharia. I also don't want a Catholic state that rules everything. Like that was the original ordinance, was that the Catholic Church was above the state and the state was below the Catholic Church. And then when the Americans and then in the Reformation it became the state was above the church. But you want it so there's separation of church and state to protect the church, and then there's democracy of the church. That's what I see.
yeah. And it's also interesting because I remember in that interview he was talking about because the criticism of Christian nationalism or Christendom 2.0, as he's talking about, is that it's basically just a rebranded theological version of America First. But then what he says is you have to consider like what happens when you have three nations which all he said confess Christ as their Lord. How can they interact? So you end up with a sort of Christian internationalism. I
Yeah,
remember Bernard of mathematical metaphysics basically talks about how you need that globalism and nationalism is a false dichotomy, that you need an assembly of nations which can interact with each other in a positive way without oligarchical control from the top.
I think that's the thesis of Immanuel Kant's SM Perpetual Peace, or something like
Mhm.
that. The democrat and there's a thesis that democratic nations don't go to war with each other, which is generally true. So what about democratic Christian nations? Wouldn't that be a good world to live in? Because they wouldn't enforce it. Wouldn't like Doug Wilson says in 1894 the Supreme Court, or 1892, I think, the Supreme Court ruled that the United States was a Christian nation, but 2 years later, it wasn't like The Handmaid's Tale. It wasn't like Christian nationalists enforcing their will on everybody in their own country and like forcing women to marry and forcing this and forcing that, executing people and torturing people. Like that's not what it's like. Christianity is a different religion. It's a religion of peace and love if it's followed faithfully.
Yeah.
Yep.
Aristotle says something to the effect. Doug Wilson quotes him in this. I don't know what it's from, but he says, do you want behavior that democracy is like, or behavior that preserves democracy? So
Exactly.
ultimately, to have good societies and peacefully interacting societies, and we can have a good international stage, you have to make recourse to the truths which actually stand behind the changes of time, and I think
Yeah.
that's where also the CTMU comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. It's good. Do you mind if we wrap up now, or was there
Uh,
a final point that you wanted to?
no, is there anything final you want to say?
Uh, I'm doing more videos on spirituality now, like I did one on spiritual warfare. Uh, I like the CTMU. I want to have a diverse range around my thought, and uh, I was also going to say that like it comes with the territory that we're all limited in our knowledge and our capabilities. We have a certain number of daylight hours in a day, and so when you think about these titanic issues, don't feel small. And the CTMU compatriots is where it's going to be at. I hope we can get minds together and get this working because, like you said, I'm glad you brought up that quote by Langan that there needs to be a priesthood like Langan has provided the what's called the extant material, EXANT, and TANT, extant material. So the existing written and verbal material online to spread his system. He's provided that. It's up to us now. It's up to the CTMU compatriots and the CTMU audience that participates in the victory. So with that, bye.
But
Good talking to you. I'm like Dr. Evil. I didn't have the dramatic exit.
all right, but